What whiskey makes the best old-fashioned? Is it going to be Irish? Is it going to be the classic bourbon? Or is it even going to be Scotch whiskey? Let's find out in this video. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and I do love making cocktails that feature whiskey. And it is always kind of important to know what whiskey you're using in a cocktail because it does change the flavor. But sometimes you can change it up. You can add a different kind of note by using different whiskeys. Maybe you can take a bourbon cocktail, add a Scotch and add a different note, or take a Scotch cocktail and an Irish whiskey and make a different, maybe softer note to your cocktail. So it's always fun to try out different cocktails, and I'm probably going to be looking at a few other classic cocktails to see which whiskey makes for the best version of that classic cocktail, and where else to start than with the best, the OG, the old-fashioned classic cocktail, the old-fashioned. So this week I'm going to be making 3 different old fashions, tasting them against each other and see which one is the most rounded, which one is the best kind of flavor for you. The 3 whiskeys I've chosen are pretty good cocktail whiskeys. This is the Jameson Black Barrel. It takes the standard Jameson whiskey and it adds an extra layer of oak char to it. So when you add it to a cocktail, it does add a bit of extra spiciness, adds a bit of extra sweetness and a bit of extra depth to your cocktails. This is the Monkey Shoulder Scotch, well regarded as the kind of best Scotch whiskey for cocktails. Not a lot of recipes do call for Scotch whiskies, but when they do, Monkey Shoulder is always a safe bet. And lastly, we got the Wild Turkey 81 proof. Now I do prefer using the Wild Turkey 101, that higher proof version, for cocktails when I'm making them, but because this is 40%, this is 40%, I decided I use the 81 proof, which is 40.5% alcohol, just to keep things fair, so we can get the notes of the whiskey as opposed to maybe the higher, stronger notes coming through than you'd get with that higher proof Wild Turkey. Another way of keeping things fair is I'm going to be using the same ingredients. I'm going to be using plain old simple 1-to-1 sugar syrup. I'm going to be using 2 dashes of Angostura bitters and 1 dash of orange bitters into each cocktail. I'm not going to be adding any garnish or anything like that. It's going to be just the plain, simple, classic version of a cocktail, and that's all there is. So that's enough talking about this little experiment. Let's get to actually making our cocktails. You should know at this point how to make a good old-fashioned, but how I like to make my old-fashioned is very simple. It's 2 ounces of whatever whiskey I'm using, 1 bar spoon of sugar syrup, and then whatever bitters I'm using. So that's what I'm going to be doing here. I'm not going to be adding the ice yet so I can control the dilution, so I'm just going to make the base cocktail for each of my cocktails. I'm going to start off with my Jameson over here. This is, like I said, it's going to be 2 ounces or 60 ml of my Jameson into the glass, and then I'm going to go in with the rest of my ingredients. I'm going to go in with my sugar syrup. For my sugar syrup, like I said, just a bar spoon, very simple, about 5 ml of sugar into there, just to keep things nice and sweet without overpowering the flavors in the whiskey. Then it's going to be, like I said earlier, 2 dashes of Angostura and 1 dash of orange bitters. You can think of Angostura bitters as kind of like your salt and your pepper. It really goes into a lot of cocktails because it adds a lot of depth, and for me, I don't really think any old-fashioned is complete without a good dash of Angostura bitters in there. And now I'm going to wash out this little measuring tin and complete that process for the other 2 cocktails. And that there was my last ingredient into these 3 cocktails. Well, it's kind of my last ingredient because when you're making an old-fashioned, it's always important to remember your ice. And so for me, I've got my ice here and I've got 3 nice ice cubes. I'm going to add them in to my glasses. I'm going to stir each one for about 30 stirs just to keep everything nice and even across all 3 cocktails. So I'm going to get my nice cube of ice, drop it in, and stir that away 30 times. Okay, and that was there 30 stirs on my final cocktail. So right here in front of me, I've got 3 different old fashions. I've got an Irish whiskey old fashioned, I've got a Scottish whiskey old fashioned, and I've got a bourbon old fashioned. So, gonna start off with the first cocktail I made, the Irish. Cheers. I'm getting the kind of oaky spice you get from the Jameson Black Barrel, but I'm also getting a lot of the bitters notes coming through because Irish whiskey is typically softer on the nose. It might deliver a lot in the palate, but typically on the nose, quite soft. Very different here with the Monkey Shoulder. That's Scottish whiskey. That kind of funky malt note is definitely very strong there. You can still get the sugary sweetness, you can still get the kind of notes and the bitters coming through, but a lot of the malt coming through as well on the nose. And here you've got the Wild Turkey. Wild Turkey 81, very sweet. More of the oak, more of that kind of almost peanut brittle, peanut caramel note you get on the Wild Turkey has come through here. So definitely more of the kind of ingredients here, more of that kind of whiskey note here, and definitely way more of the whiskey note here on the Wild Turkey. And next up, it's just about how it tastes. Cheers. Yeah, like I said, the Irish whiskies typically deliver on the palate. You got that oak spice. You got more of the whiskey comes through on the palate here than on the nose. Definitely the nose very soft, more of the ingredients here, more of that whiskey bite comes through. Still very sweet, still a very soft, almost kind of subtle whiskey there. It's not the most overpowering, it's very nice, like it's very soft. I'll go into the other whiskies now, but that's definitely starting off quite a soft whiskey. Bit of water to clean the palate. Next up, it's the Monkey Shoulder. Cheers. I'll save final judgment for after the Wild Turkey, but I can definitely see why not a lot of cocktails do always call for Scotch whiskey, because that kind of heavier, funkier, deeper, earthy malt note you get with Scotch whiskies does have to be kind of balanced out in a cocktail that calls for it. Yeah, it's nice. It's an old fashioned. An old fashioned is going to be a great cocktail, but definitely more of the whiskey note coming through here. And you know, if you're going to be drinking whiskey, drink your whiskey. If you're going to be drinking a whiskey cocktail, drink a whiskey cocktail. Next up, it is the last whiskey, the Wild Turkey. Very sweet. That is actually really sweet. That is probably the sweetest of the three coming through. Again, using the Wild Turkey 81 instead of like the 101, you're going to get a very sweet whiskey. Very sweet. Again, quite oaky, more oaky than the Jameson, but also much more sweet. Those kind of fruity notes you get in the Jameson, not really present here, but you get more of that almost drying oak. The almost like peanutty note is still there, but it's more to the back. It's just oak and sweetness up front, again accented and lifted by those bitters, which were pretty absent on the Monkey Shoulder whiskey. Yeah, that Monkey Shoulder is definitely a unique enough taste. I mean, again, it's not a bad whiskey, but it is it's a good whiskey for cocktails. It's not a bad whiskey at all. If you like Scotch whiskies, I mean, this is well regarded as the best Scottish whiskey for cocktails, but right up against other two whiskies, which I would probably lean to more for cocktails, the Irish and the Bourbon. It definitely is more that malt, more that earthiness, and less of the kind of flavors you'd expect in a cocktail. So I'd probably only recommend this one for someone who's a Scotch whiskey drinker or someone who wants to try something a bit different. For these two though, they're both nice, they're both good whiskies. They do serve, I think, slightly different purposes. The Jameson one, like I said, it's softer. It's a bit, I don't want to say more rounded, because this is a very nice full flavored whiskey, but it's a little bit more rounded off in every direction, which also means it doesn't lean into any one direction in any specific way. So if you're maybe someone who's newer to whiskey cocktails, if you think an old fashioned, which is just spirit, sugar, and a bit of bitters, which themselves are alcoholic, if you think that's a lot of alcohol, you're used to whiskey sours, used to whiskeys with soda, this one, the Irish whiskey, is probably your first kind of foray in there without being overpowering. The Bourbon, if you like that oaky, spicy bite you get in a Bourbon, you're not going to get it in the other whiskeys, you're only going to get it from here. So if you're a Bourbon drinker, if you like those oaky, alcohol, drying notes, if you like something like a Boulevardier, those kind of rye whiskey cocktails, or those Aperol kind of, you know, Italian bitter cocktail forward cocktails, if you like that, you might like here, because the oak bite, that drying spice does come through. But these two, the Irish and the Bourbon, is where I'd be leaning for. If you want to try it an old fashioned, go for these first, but maybe avoid the Monkey Shoulder unless you really love Scotch. So there you have it. Those are my kind of final views on where these whiskies fit for making old fashions. I'll be trying out other cocktails with these three whiskies in future. If you want to see more videos like that, I put out cocktail recipes on Friday. I put out whiskey reviews where I reviewed each of these 3 whiskies every Wednesday. So if you want to see more of that, scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button. For me, I'd probably lean a little bit more towards the Irish whiskey because Irish whiskey is my favorite style of whiskey, but the bourbon is a very, very close second. So I'm probably going to be enjoying both of these later, and I might try and pawn off the monkey shoulder onto Rose, my wife, who also joins me on some whiskey reviews and some cocktail recipes on the channel. If you have a favorite whiskey you have for an old fashioned, let me know down below. If you can, try to keep it in that kind of 40% bracket so it's kind of fair across all, but let me know what your favorite is anyway, and I will see you next time. Sláinte.